Well, only 4% of Gen Z has a biblical worldview. Now, if you're like, well, that's Gen Z's problem, that's not mine. It does not get better with other generations. Millennials is about 6%, Gen X is about 7%, and baby boomers about 10%. And what this study shows is really that a lot of people who claim to be Christians actually do not hold a biblical worldview or a consistent biblical worldview. So there's a lot of questions on what does that mean? What does it mean to have a biblical worldview? What is a biblical worldview? Why does it matter? That is going to be the topic of today's show. It's going to be a good and important conversation. My name is Ryan Pauly, and this is the show Think Well, the show that is designed to train you to think well about the Christian faith so that you can engage the culture well. So hopefully having worldview perspectives and understanding how different people think and how they look at the world so that we can engage the world better. And that is the hope in every show that I put on and why we are here today. I'm going to take a little bit of time and do some teaching. I try to stick to 30 minutes, although sometimes I do go over with announcements and everything like that at the beginning. And then I open it up to your calls for you to challenge my worldview and my beliefs and my assumptions, ask questions. That is, I think, the best part about the show. And that's one thing I love doing and I love being here. So if you are here, thanks for being here. Let me jump in really quickly because there are some changes in future weeks. So again, if you're watching after the fact and you want to skip this, go ahead and skip it. I generally put timestamps at the bottom so you can see all the different callers and questions that I address as well as the topics that I cover. But there are going to be some changes in the coming weeks. And so let me just let you know. Next week, I will be doing the evil God hypothesis. This question has come up in a few different calls recently. So I want to go back and I want to look into this. However, I'm teaching a college course on why God allows evil, and that ends on Saturday. And I have to finalize and complete all of my students' grades by the following Wednesday of next week, which means I'll have about 4 days to grade 40 papers. And so I'm estimating that I'm not going to have time to really prep for a show by Tuesday of next week. However, all that is due by Wednesday. So I'm hoping Thursday or Friday, I should be able to have a show ready to go. And so that is going to be next week, Evil God Hypothesis pushed back. Then the week after that, I'm actually going to be gone, a little getaway with my wife. And so I will not be in town on Tuesday. And so that one will be pushed back till Thursday or Friday as well. And that one I'm thinking about doing some responding to some TikTok videos. I spend a lot of time on there, or not a lot of time, but I scroll through and I see what people are posting and I follow a lot of different atheist accounts. And I always hope to make little short content videos to address some of those concerns and objections. However, that has not happened. And so what better way to just play a few on the show and talk through them before taking your call. So Evil God Hypothesis next week and the TikTok videos the week after that. Both those are going to be pushed back to later in the week, not on Tuesday. Then we'll follow up on the weekly live stream at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time. July 15, the next part of our culture series on transgenderism. July 22, the next part of our worldview series on media, journalism, and communications. And then at the end of July 29, I'm actually going to be gone in Utah on a Maven immersive experience, so there will not be any shows then. So the next 4 shows, Evil God Hypothesis, responding to TikTok videos, transgenderism, and then media, journalism, and communications. So, I think that's most of my announcements. Let me just throw this out there. If you haven't noticed, hanging around the show a little bit, I don't have any ads at all. I make YouTube not put any ads in the video. I don't like mid-roll ads to where you're right in the middle of a conversation or a discussion with an atheist or whoever calls in, and then all of a sudden an ad pops up. And so I don't have that. People who contact me, I say, no, I don't want to sell your product on my show. But I do have some of my own products. You got some Think Well merch that just came out because students used to just keep asking me, hey, do you have any merch? Do you have any merch? So I created a merch store. I've announced this every now and then, but there's shirts and sweaters and little kids stuff and hats and beanies and coffee mugs. So if you are interested in kind of supporting this work, supporting the show and hopefully getting into conversations and helping people think well and wanting to think well with people, you can pick up some Think Well merch. You can go to the website, think-well.org, and you find it there on YouTube. Tab has it as well. So anyways, I think that is all my announcements. Gen Z, Barna Research Group teamed up with Impact 360, and they produced this, actually it's a 3-part series. They have 3 volumes. Gen Z, the culture, beliefs, and motivations shaping the next generation. Volume 2 was caring for young souls and cultivating resilience. And then part 3 was tackling the challenging beliefs, values, and attitudes of a generation coming of age. And so there's 3-part kind of series that Gen Z and on Gen Z from Barna, as well as Impact 360, a lot of really interesting information here. But as I mentioned at the beginning, one thing that they found in this study is that only 4% of Gen Z, 6% of millennials, 7% of Gen X, and 10% of baby boomers actually hold a biblical worldview. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this worldview study is I want to say, okay, how has the Christian intellectual tradition shaped all of these different components of life? How do we actually have a whole life perspective where we see the Christian worldview and the Christian intellectual tradition really impacting and shaping everything? Because what we recognize is like, with Gen Z, 42% of Gen Z, 51% of elders, 48% of boomers would identify as Christian. There's another large percentage with, for example, the older generation like boomers and elders, 51% as Christian, non-Catholic, 24% as Catholic. So that is 75% either Christian or Catholic. With Gen Z, it's 42% Christian, 17% Catholic. And so you're talking about 59%. So while there's 59% of Gen Z saying I'm Christian or Catholic, only 4% actually have a biblical worldview. And so that's one of the reasons I want to take and kind of walk through this study. And specifically, where did I put it? Here it is. The book for this week is specifically on the Christian worldview, right? This is the series I'm using for this study, is the Reclaiming the Christian Intellectual Tradition from Crossway. And Crossway has so graciously offered me 1 book per month to walk through this study and just said, hey, talk about it, show it, and I am graciously accepting because this has been a great series. I've really enjoyed it, and it's kind of going to force me into some topics like media journalism and communication next month that I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about. How has Christianity shaped that? So hopefully I can kind of walk along that. We'll walk through that with you. And so this one is on specifically the Christian worldview and kind of what is a worldview and why does it matter and what is the biblical worldview. Now, for the purposes of this study, one of the challenges that often comes up with this topic is, well, what is a biblical worldview or what is a Christian worldview and why do you think that there is a Christian worldview? Christians can't agree on hardly anything. And there's so many different Christian views that we should actually say Christian worldviews or Christianities, not just one certain Christianity, because Christians disagree on virtually everything. And we're going to talk about this a little bit as we jump into this book. But as far as this research, when they say that 4% of Gen Z has a biblical worldview, the question is, what does that mean? How are they getting this number? And so they actually post what are the specific questions that they think would have to be believed in order to be considered having a biblical worldview. So there were, I believe, 9 questions. So here they are. Number 1, have you made a personal commitment to Jesus that is important in your life today? Right. And so if you're saying, no, I don't have a commitment to Jesus, then you're not following Jesus. You're not a Christian in that sense. And so the person has to have a personal commitment that they actually think is important in their life. Number 2, you believe that you will go to heaven or hell. You believe that you go to heaven when they die because you have confessed your sins and accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior. So this is just trying to summarize in a simple sense, what is the gospel? Do you believe that by having faith in Jesus Christ, you will go to heaven? Again, if you're saying no, that seems to be rejecting a very core piece, or that is rejecting a very core piece of Christianity in salvation by faith in Jesus Christ. Number 3, do you believe that the Bible is accurate and is the word of God, right? Is the Bible the revelation of God? If you're saying, no, I don't think the Bible is accurate or it's not revealed by God, then it's counted as not having a biblical worldview. Number 4, do you agree that we have a responsibility to tell others about our religious beliefs, right? So now here is the creation mandate and the gospel mandate, go make disciples of all nations. This is a core piece of at least evangelical Christianity, the evangelical part being the evangelism and how do we go out and share and actually have conversations. If you're like, no, I don't want to talk about this. I don't think we should talk about it. There's not a responsibility to talk about it. At least Barna has decided that is a key component of saying, do you believe and follow Jesus and see the mission that he has called you to as a worthy calling of making disciples and being an ambassador of Jesus Christ, as 2 Corinthians 5:20 talks about. Number 5, do you disagree with the statement Jesus Christ committed sins when he lived on earth? So they say, okay, did Jesus Christ commit sins? And if you say, yes, Jesus was sinful, then they're saying you don't have a biblical worldview. So you have to have a true idea about who Jesus is the sinless, Son of God, but that's not part of this question. Number 6, do you disagree that the devil or Satan is not a living being, but a symbol of evil? So they made this comment, Satan, or the devil, is not an actual living being, but he's just a symbol of evil. And in order for them have a biblical worldview, you would have to disagree and say, no, I don't just think he's a symbol of evil. He's actually a living being who exists and has rebelled against God. Number 7 is you have to disagree that a person can earn a place in heaven if they are generally good or if they do enough good things for others. And so this whole idea of, do you go to heaven just because you have faith in Jesus Christ, or are we actually good people who, if we do enough good things, we can earn our way to heaven? Their belief is that this contradicts the gospel, and therefore you don't have a biblical worldview if you believe in a works-based salvation, that you are inherently good or you can do enough good in order to get yourself into heaven. Number 8 is that they would say that you have to believe that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and the perfect creator of the universe who rules the world today. And so if you reject, and so they don't have every single attribute of God listed here, just all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect creator and ruler of the universe. Those are their 8 criteria at least. And so one thing to notice here is this is a pretty introductory test. This is not asking views on eschatology or how to interpret difficult Bible passages or women in ministry and Calvinism, Arminianism, age of the earth. Like, none of these highly debated, controversial things are here that as Christians, we should recognize are secondary and tertiary. These are not central core teachings of Christianity. What they've tried to do is stick to the core teachings of Christianity. Do you have a personal faith that's important? Do you believe that you go to heaven because of salvation through Jesus? The Bible is God's word. You have a responsibility to live for Jesus. Jesus was not a sinful being. The devil is real. You cannot go to heaven by being a good person, and God is all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect creator. If you answer those questions accurately, at least according to this study, then you have a biblical worldview. Only 4% of Gen Z, 6% of millennials, 7% of Gen X, and 10% of baby boomers actually answered those 8 questions in the affirmative or disagree when they need to disagree to be considered having a biblical worldview. So this seems to be serious. It's like, hey, there's a lot of people claiming to be Christians that aren't consistently holding a Christian worldview. And so that's one of the reasons, again, why I'm doing the study, why I want to walk through this book, is to try to help us. What is a Christian worldview? And so after I kind of walk through these different chapters and kind of the main key ideas, I want to jump to your questions. So hopefully 30 minutes from now, which is at 42 minutes into the show, we will jump to your calls and your questions. So you can start putting them in the live chat with a Q, or you can use the link that I posted there to join the show and chat with me live. So, A Christian Worldview, a Student's Guide by Philip Grand Ryken. Really quickly, Philip Grand Ryken, who authored this edition or this book in the series, has his doctorate of philosophy, his D.Phil from the University of Oxford. He was the 8th president of Wheaton College, has lectured and taught at universities and seminaries worldwide. He's authored more than 30 books, including Kingdom Come, Grace Transforming, and Loving the Way of Jesus. And again, if this is the first part of yours for this series, this is part 5 of the Worldview series, where we're reclaiming the Christian Intellectual Tradition series, which is designed for Christian students and those associated with college campuses to address challenges in major academic disciplines by reclaiming the best of the Christian intellectual tradition and demonstrating a vibrant, world-changing Christianity assumes a commitment to the integration of faith and scholarship. That's another reason why I love this series, is it really is trying to emphasize the integration of faith and scholarship. This is not just a blind faith and just close my eyes and believe, but really how a deep intellectual tradition and deep scholarship has actually shaped a wide range of disciplines. And so in this book is, again, a brief introduction to worldview. He talks about what a worldview is, how it's the center of everything, the way we are, and then he goes into the biblical worldview, the way we are, paradise lost, a work in progress, and then paradise consummated. And so to begin, I think it's important to define a worldview. According to him, a worldview is a world and life view, as some people call it, or is the structure of understanding what we use to make sense of our world. Or another way of putting it, it is the comprehensive framework of our basic belief about things, the set of hinges on which our everyday thinking and doing turns. And so I think what is important here to recognize is that if a worldview is our view of the world, our understanding of how to make sense of the world, literally every single person has a worldview. And this is also why it's so important, I think, to understand worldviews, because when you come up to someone who has a different worldview, in understanding why they think differently is very helpful for figuring out how to engage them. So one of the questions I got from Instagram on this topic was kind of what some other worldviews believe and what are some different worldviews. So I thought I would just try to show this to you briefly. This is a worldview chart that Summit Ministries has created. Now, they have broken up different views into 6 major worldviews. You see those across the top of the chart. So if I zoom in here, they have secularism, Marxism, postmodernism, new spirituality, Islam, and Christianity is what they've deemed to be the 6 major worldviews. Now, on the left side, you can see they are trying to identify how how these 6 different views viewed 10 different academic disciplines, from theology, philosophy, ethics, biology, psychology, sociology, law, politics, economics, and history. And so Summit is very clear to identify and to point out that this doesn't perfectly define every single person who falls in every single one of these categories, but they kind of use the analogy of football, where if there's different formations in football, there's different ways in which the team can approach the line of scrimmage, and there's different formations. And within each formation, you can run a variety of plays. There can be differences, but within certain formations, some plays are kind of off the table. Like, they're most likely not going to do this if they're in that formation. And so they kind of break this up and say, hey, this is like helping you understand there's 6 big, broad kind of formations, 6 big categories. And there can be a lot of variation within those categories. And maybe people aren't going to fit perfectly. But at least having the idea of the 6 broad categories is helpful as you try to understand the people that you are talking to. So, really quickly, as you see there on the left, when it comes to Christianity, that far right column, when it comes to theology, they would say that Christians are Trinitarian monotheists, that we believe in one God who is Trinity. When it comes to philosophy, we are dualists. We believe that there is both the spiritual world and the physical world, that there are 2 substances that exist, the physical and non-physical. Our ethics is based on agape, love of God and love of neighbor. They would say that our biology is some sort of special creation. Whether that's old earth or young earth, that's debatable, but the fact that God created. When it comes to our psychology, they would say that we are mind-body dualists, that we have both a mind and a body, and those are separate, and as you see there, and that our mind-body dualism is a fallen nature that we have. When it comes to their views on sociology, they believe in, they say that Christian worldview is on sphere sovereignty, that we believe that there's the church, the government, the church, the government, and the family. These are 3 distinct spheres. This was kind of popularized by Abraham Kuyper, a theologian, who said, these are different spheres of influence, and when one grows too big, it presses out and hurts the other one. And we've seen throughout history when the government was too big and too powerful and did abusive stuff. We saw when the church was too big and too powerful, and we saw when families were too big and too powerful. And really, we have to let each sphere be in charge of what it's God-given, over its God-given domain, and that's when society will function best. When it comes to law, they would say that we hold to a natural law view, that law is grounded in nature, and we can use our reason, our intellect, and rationality to access that law. When it comes to politics, they hold to the principle of subsidiarity, which is that the people closest to the issue are the best ones to solve it. Economics is biblical stewardship, of how do we steward over the things that God has created. And then also in history, it is how do we look at history in a redemptive narrative. So that would kind of be some 10 points that we can talk about when it comes to a biblical worldview. Now, again, if you want to chat more about that, post a question in the live chat and I'd be happy to chat with you about it. In contrast, I'll just kind of run through secularism here really quickly. They would say that a secular view, the theology is going to be atheism, that there is no God, or the lack of belief in God, as some atheists want to describe it to be. Their philosophy is they're going to have a materialism and naturalism. So there's probably only a physical world, and there's a natural explanation for all things. And that's how this book at least would define materialism, is that only matter exists, and naturalism is that there's a natural explanation versus a supernatural explanation. Ethics is going to be some sort of moral relativism or utilitarianism. It's going to be some sort of kind of pragmatic ethic of looking at the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is also called a teleological ethic, an ethic based on some sort of end goal that is decided by society, which is there's that relativism component. Biology is going to hold to some sort of evolution. Psychology is most likely, because there's only physical bodies, it's going to hold to a mind-body monism, that we are just physical bodies and with brains, and that the mind and consciousness is probably not a real substance. It's just a product of the brain or something of that nature. Sociology, that we should have personal autonomy, that we should be, free to do whatever we want as long as you don't hurt anybody, sort of idea. Law, legal positivism. This is where the government can create laws, and laws do not have an inherent connection with morality. So it's not that our morality should drive what laws that we create, but really law and morality is disconnected, because morality is not objective. It's moral relativism. And so then we just decide as society what sort of laws we want. And so this idea of society chosen laws. Politics holds some sort of progressive politics, that we're constantly getting better and growing and moving on. Economics is sometimes hold to some sort of economic interventionism of stepping in and helping out in certain ways, and then a social progress view of history. So a lot more could be said. I'm trying to just go briefly. There's other charts there. So if you want me to cover any of the other views, let me know. But this is kind of, again, helpful to see the big picture, so that when we are having these sort of worldview conversations, you go, okay, I get why. For example, in my conversation like last week with Mirza, when we were talking on morality, and he was saying, that morality is all relative. There is no objective transcendent standard by which we can judge these actions, and therefore it is just decided by society. And so that would be very consistent within a secular view, because if there is no God and there is no transcendent standard, then it would make sense that we are the highest authority, and therefore we make the rules. And so this is going to be a worldview assumption that comes into play. Hopefully that helps for the person who wanted a little bit of an overview on that. Now, what is it that shapes our worldview? I think this is really important to start out with as we're talking about why worldviews. Now, the big worldview questions. Why is there anything? Why are we here? How do we know things, right? This is our epistemology. How do we know what we know? How did we get here? Why are we here? Where did we come from? Why does it matter? Why are things so bad? Why is our world so broken? Is there any hope in fixing things in the world? What should I do with my life? What's the purpose of life? Where do we go after this life? Is there an afterlife? Is there life after this death? These are these big worldview questions that each of these worldviews is going to try to make sense of, where like in a secular view, there is no God. How do we get here? Through some sort of understanding of the origin of life and the origin of the universe, and evolution has produced our species, and that is why we're here. What's the purpose? Well, there's no objective transcendent purpose. You are free to kind of determine your own purpose. Why are things so broken? Well, because people have evolved different characteristics, and people choose to do things that go against our society's norms. And so our hope is to try to have more laws and maybe more correction and more control over people, and to persuade them to stop following false ideas and things that are destructive, and try to use reason and evidence and science to grow and understand. And what happens when we die? Well, nothing. You just cease to exist, right? And that would kind of be a secular look at the world versus a Christian view. God exists. He created us. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. Now, what contributes to our worldview? I want to show you this worldview triangle that I actually took from a book from J. Warner Wallace and Sean McDowell. And they talk about this worldview triangle. And what they want to suggest is this. At the top of the triangle, what we see with people is we see their behaviors. We see how people behave, and whether we like what they behave or we don't like how they behave. This is the behaviors that people have. And you go, okay, so that is the behaviors that people have, but what is it that informs behaviors? Well, what's informing behaviors is your values. Right. And simple with students. If you value education, you're going to spend more time maybe studying. If you value sports, you spend more time practicing. Whatever you value is going to result or get played out in the behaviors that you have. But here's the question. This was, again, the conversation I had with Mirza last week he said, well, this is my value. I have these values. And that then is shaping the behavior and the conversation that I and him had. The question, though, is what informs our values? And the answer is our worldview. It is our worldview that tells us what is valuable and therefore shapes our behaviors. And so often if we're working with students, if you're a Christian parent listening, you're like, man, I'm trying to work with my student. Well, what behaviors does your student have that maybe are destructive or are not great, or maybe you're trying to shape in them? And then the question is, okay, well, so what values do they hold that is leading to that behavior, and how do they view the world that is maybe informing those values leading to their behavior? For example, my worldview says that all human beings are created in the image of God. I should then value humans and I should then treat humans well. There's my behavior. If my worldview says God exists and has a plan for my life and has called me to know him and make him known, then I'm going to value knowing God and making him known. And therefore my behavior is going to be shaped by understanding God and spending time in the Bible and reading and evangelizing and trying to make him known and let people know about him. If my worldview says there is no God, you're here by the product of evolution, and there is no ultimate purpose in life, and kind of live how you want to live, then I value the things that I want to value, and that's going to shape my behaviors as well. Here's then the question. If all of us have a worldview that informs our values and shapes our behavior, what shapes our worldview? And that is our relationships. And I think it's deeper than this. In the book here, Philip Ryken writes, many factors contribute to our worldview, but not all of them the product of our own thoughtful reflection. We often don't really deeply think about this. He goes on and says, our family background, our life experiences, our economic circumstances, educational pedigree, cultural context, national heritage, linguistic community, psychological characteristics, physiological characteristics, psychological makeup, and historical situation all have an influence on the way that we see the world. And so we have a ton of influences from within our relationships and our cultural context and our family and all of this that is having a huge influence and huge impact on our worldview. It's shaping how we see the world and then informs us of what is valuable and shapes our behaviors. And so this is why it is so important to stop and think critically about the topic of worldview. Now, one thing he also addresses here in the introductory chapter on what is a worldview that I found really, really important. He says this: there are a lot of criticisms. Say, okay, Ryan, do we really need more worldview thinking? Do we need Christians that's out there thinking about stuff? We actually need Christians who do stuff. We need people who actually love and care. I had a friend once challenge me. He's like, man, why do you just sit here and discuss and argue about whether God exists? Why don't you do something useful like plant a tree? And this idea of like, why don't you just do more? Why don't you love more? Why don't you care more? Why just think? And these are some of the objections that people have. For example, in this book, he addresses James K.A. Smith, who called it for a temporary moratorium on the term worldview. And his concern was that the worldview approach tends to reduce human beings to disembodied thinkers, when in fact we are embodied lovers. Smith argued that what causes us to act is not only what we know, but mainly what we adore. Before we can articulate a worldview, he says that we worship. In effect, worship is the matrix from which the Christian worldview is born. So instead of focusing on what Christians should think or distilling the Christian faith into an intellectual summary formula or a worldview, we should pay more attention to the practices of Christian worship. What will transform us is not information for the mind, but formation of the heart through the liturgy of the church. So this is the objection of saying, well, hey, let's maybe back off on this worldview thinking and look at it a different way. Now, in response, though, Philip Ryken says this: we can learn from these and other criticisms without jettisoning the vital project of articulating a Christian view of the world. Worldview thinking should be rejuvenated, not rejected. Even if our present grasp of the truth is a work in progress, it is still necessary to defend the truth and live it out as well as we can. We can acknowledge, here I think this is an important part, we can acknowledge the formative influence of liturgical and other practices without devaluing the intellect. We are relational creatures. While it is true that what we love often shapes what we think, it is also true that the biblical remedy for distorted affections for God is to speak his truth to the mind. where the scripture says, do not be conformed to this world, Paul writes. In other words, do not be shaped by the thinkings of this world. It is patterns and practices. Instead, the apostle goes on to say in Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And he says this, and here's where I'll finish. There's an intrinsic, ordered relationship between the thoughts and the affections that guide our actions. The formation of the heart comes through the transformation of the mind. Therefore, one of the primary ways of the Holy Spirit changes the things we love and worship is by changing the way we think. And so I found that to be fascinating, is that yes, there is liturgical things, and yes, there are ways that we love, but how do we shape the ways that we love? And often it's by shaping the ways that we think. And this is what brings us back here to the worldview triangle. If what we think about the world is wrong, it is going to give us wrongly informed values that then lead to wrong behaviors. And often, and I think what he's arguing here is that if we want to shape behaviors to where we become people who love better, that often is shaped and transformed, or one of the ways that God does this is by shaping our thinking. Now, can we just make this purely thinking and not actually practice? Yes, that can happen. And so there's a both and here. And that's why he's saying it's not to just throw out the intellect and only focus on the liturgy and also on the loves and longings, but it's a both and. Yes, we need to have a right focus on loving people and liturgy and worship, but this is often informed by what we think. All right. Now, that was a way longer introduction than what I wanted, and I have like 10 minutes left before I kind of wanted to be done and start taking questions. So again, if you have questions, post them in the live chat or use the link to call and join the show. He breaks up this book then into a few different parts, and he talks about the next few chapters is the center of everything, which is God, the way we are, paradise lost, a work in progress, and then paradise consummated. Now, unfortunately, I had a bunch of technical issues that I was trying to work on, and so I did not finish prepping the last few chapters. I don't have all my thoughts perfectly lined out here. I read them, but I don't have them out here. But here's what he says in the first few chapters, a center of everything. The first off is this, is that in the Christian worldview focuses on creation, the fall, what he calls grace, and then glory. Some people say creation, fall, redemption, restoration is how some people put it. He says this, creation, the way God created the world and everything in it, including the people he made in his own image, with the ultimate goal of displaying his glory. Number two, the second aspect of the Christian worldview is fall. That way, the way that we turned away from our Creator, choosing to live for ourselves rather than for our Father's glory, and thus came under the condemnation of a righteous God in a sin-cursed world. The third aspect then is grace, the way God is working to save his people from sin and death through the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, his Son, then transforming our lives by the power of the Holy Spirit. And number four, the fourth part is glory, the way God is fulfilling all his purposes for the people through the present and future preeminence of Jesus Christ over the everlasting kingdom of God. And so these are kind of the four parts of a Christian worldview: creation, fall, grace, glory, or creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And so the first part is creation, God. It is the God who is there. And I think it's important to point out here is this idea, and this has come up in conversations with skeptics that have called in for the last few weeks, is that we, as a Christian, our worldview has to begin with God, but it's not just a mere belief in God, but that if there is a God, we must believe in the God who is really there and not some other God. And so in a Christian worldview, it is the God of the Bible who is all-knowing, all-present, all-powerful, all-sufficient. He alone is infinite, eternal, unchangeable in wisdom, power, holiness, goodness, justice, truth, and love. The key component here in forming a Christian worldview is that God exists in reality, and he has certain defining characteristics and qualities and attributes, and he is not a God of our own making. I feel like I get challenged frequently on this show of like, well, that's just your belief about God, or that's just what you think about God. And I'm like, yes, I do think these things, but the claim that I'm making is that I think them because that's what's actually true. This is not something that is created. Our thoughts do not create God. God created us, and therefore we discover. Just like we discover what is true about the world, we discovered that the earth rotates around the sun, we discovered gravity, we are to discover things about God, and I can discover things that are true, but I can also investigate and come to wrong conclusions. And so the hope and goal of a Christian in the beginning starting point is to say there's a God who is really out there, not just that I have some belief in some nebulous some sort of higher power, but it is very specifically the God of Christianity, the biblical God who is all powerful, all loving, all knowing, and these sort of things. And that's not just a belief that Christians have. It's something that we claim to have discovered. The Christian view is also that God is Trinity. And that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit each is God. They each share the same divine essence, but they are not the same. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father. And so I've done a few other shows, and I can kind of link up here to the top on the Trinity and understanding the biblical arguments for it and the logic of the Trinity. But again, this is an important distinction. And one of the things I said in the show on the Trinity is it's actually the Trinitarian view of God that Christianity holds, that the Bible teaches, that is the core fundamental distinction of Christianity that separates it from all other religions. There's other views that are just monotheist, one God, that's it. There's other views that are polytheist. There's views that are pantheist. Everything is God, or there are many gods, or there is no God. But it's only Christianity that holds to a Trinitarian monotheism. And I think this is important because, as I mentioned in that show, this is why I see frequently atheists attacking the Trinity. Because if you can show that the Trinity is not logical, or is not sound, or is not true, that undermines a first and core principle of Christianity and the Christian worldview of holding a Trinitarian God that exists. This is why when I talk to Muslims, it is the Trinity that is often the point of conversation. Is say, look, there is no Trinity. Jesus is not God. He was only a prophet. And they're going to attack on the point of the Trinity, because if they can show that the Trinity is false, then Christianity crumbles. This is a core part of the Christian worldview, is this understanding of Trinity. And so again, the point here is this is, I think, a distinction of who God is, but also a core principle of Christianity, that there is a God that exists, that has revealed himself to us, and therefore it is not my invention of him, but it is me trying my best to discover and understand him truly. That while we cannot know him fully, we can know him truly. So a question did come in here. Trafalgar Law. Sorry, thanks for being here. Ask this question. Why would a perfect, let me make this a little bit bigger. I'm not on YouTube anymore, or Instagram. Why would a perfect, timeless God care about lesser beings and worlds depicting his glory? Isn't that somewhat petty? That's a great question. I don't think it's petty. It's not for him, right? He doesn't get any better when we worship him. He does not get any worse when we don't worship him. Him depicting his glory is him just revealing himself the way he is. He is glorious. He is the greatest. He is the all-knowing, all-powerful, transcendent creator of the universe. And so he displays this. He creates this that displays his glory. And us recognizing his glory is us recognizing him how he truly is. And then when we do that, it is only then a benefit to us, not to him. And so it's not like he is some power hungry, I need your worship, I create you, now worship me because I need this. It is a complete, selfless, sacrificial love that is completely other-centered, to say, I create you and want you to recognize who I am. Why? Not because it benefits him or makes him any better, but for our benefit. That we then live in a way in which is consistent for how we were created, that we are in the best possible relationship. And again, this is a terrible analogy, but at least I think we can wrap our mind around it, is I've had some bosses in my life that were really bad, and I've had some bosses that were really good. And the bosses that were really good had a very selfless care for us as employees that was like, I just want you to flourish. I want you to succeed. I am here to make your life as easy as it can possibly be, and so that you can do the best that you can possibly do. And we knew that this boss, as employees, we knew that this boss really had our best intention in mind. And so when we stepped into that, recognized this boss's leadership and said, okay, I recognize your authority and I will do what you say, we recognize that was only for our benefit, not for theirs. And I think there's a similar component. Now we recognize when there's a bad boss, a bad authority, then that's only out there for power hungry things and for, his or her own glory, so to speak. Then it's like, okay, this is just destructive. You're just egotistical. You are just petty. You are just whatever. And you're not thinking about us. You're doing this all for your own name. God falls into that first category, where in his perfect love and sacrificed for us and all that he's done for us. It really is, I created for you to be in relationship with me, not to make him better, but for our benefit. And so that's why I think that he cares that we recognize him truly, because then that is when we are in a right response and a right position in a relationship with him that is best for us. Again, maybe a bad analogy, but I think of my own children. When I'm telling them something that is true and good for them, when they recognize that and respond positively in agreement with me, then that's just for their benefit. I'm not like, oh yeah, look how amazing I am. It's like, no, I'm telling you, don't play in the road because that's what's good. That's bad for you. And if they rebel against that and reject it, it's a saddening thing, because it really is doing something that is destructive to them. And so I think that's how I would kind of go about that. Interesting. For our benefit, do you think Christians generally would agree with you on this, or perhaps not have thought about it? I think Christians would agree that we do not make God better by worshiping him, and we do not make him worse for not worshiping him, that he created us, or he created and desires a relationship for us for our benefit. I think that most Christians would agree with that statement. And maybe they haven't thought about it, but I think those who would have thought about it, I think they would agree. God in his perfect being does not become more perfect when we worship him or not. Was Jesus a ransom? Yes, we'll get to this question here in a little bit. Jesus did pay the price for our sins. So that is a part coming up. So this is kind of the first part of the Christian worldview. Is the center of everything is who is God. He is not a God of our own making. We didn't invent him. We don't believe him into existence. Atheists don't believe him out of existence. He is there whether we like it or not. And now we are trying to discover him truly. The second part of a biblical worldview then is that God has revealed himself. He has not remained silent. He has not just created and set back like a deist view of God, that he has created and then disappeared, but he actually has spoken. He has communicated to us. Christians generally see this as general revelation and special revelation, that God reveals himself through creation, through the things that he has made, Romans 1, Psalm 19, and special revelation through his word. And so in studying creation and in studying God's word, we can learn more about him. We also believe that the main theme of Scripture is the saving work of Jesus Christ, God the Son, who is the Word of God incarnate. This is a unique claim to biblical Christianity. This is, again, why the worldview questions here is like, well, what do you believe about Jesus? Is he sinful? Did he sin? Well, no, because if he is the Son of God, and if he is God incarnate, then God can't sin, and therefore Jesus didn't sin. And so we recognize that God also reveals himself through the person of Jesus Christ. And it is in Jesus that we have true knowledge of the living God. And so he then argues that because of this, in coming to know Jesus, we then gain access to an explicitly Christ-centered view of the world. Jesus is the starting point for all of our other thought. If we believe that Jesus Christ is the true Son of God, the one who is the truth, John 14:6, then we will accept his view of God and ourselves in sin and salvation. This is a huge point, guys. So many conversations that we have when people have different worldview perspectives, one of the big differences is the presuppositions that people have about God. That when we do not trust God, when we do not believe God is actually loving or actually best, then we come to these conclusions, well, if God was truly loving, he would do this. He didn't do it, therefore he's not truly loving. And instead of saying, look, I trust that God is truly loving based on his revelation to us, and therefore if I don't understand, I'm going to trust that his way is right in that. Now, that's not crazy, right? And the simple analogy that I use all the time is like an iPhone. If I don't understand why my phone was designed a certain way, and I go, well, if Apple designers were actually smart, if they knew what they were doing, they would have designed my phone like this. But they didn't, and so they're not actually smart. Now, if you guys know me at all, I have zero knowledge whatsoever about software development or coding or any of that stuff. I'm clueless. I've studied theology and apologetics in all of my college and graduate and postgraduate work. And so if I go to claim, if my phone were designed, if Apple designers were smart, they would have made my phone like this. They didn't, and therefore they're not smart. I think most of you go, no, Ryan, you're not the smart one. The Apple designers had a reason. They know what they're doing, and there's a reason for it. And if you actually ask them, you would probably figure it out. And so I trust, hey, they probably had a good reason for this, even though I don't understand why it's this way. They probably had a reason for that. And if I asked them and said, well, why didn't you make it this way? They would go, oh, because then it blah, 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 blah. And here's how that would work. And it would do this and that, and it would all fall apart. And so we had to make it this way. And I go, oh, actually, that makes a lot of sense. Right. And so I trust that they know what they're doing. Now, if I can take that approach with fallen, sinful Apple designers, can I not take that same approach, but even more confidently with a perfect God who has revealed himself in these ways? And so I think that's something that is really helpful as we stop and think about, is that God has revealed himself through scripture, through creation, and ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ. And so when we start with Jesus, who is the truth, then we will accept his view of God and ourselves in sin and salvation. We also have to recognize Genesis chapter 3, the fall. The second aspect of the Christian worldview story is that we fell. Well, what did Adam and Eve, what was ultimately their sin? They didn't trust. When Satan said, well, God doesn't want you to do this, instead of trusting God and saying, well, his way is probably best, I'm going to continue to follow him, it was like, hey, actually, that sounds about right. Let me try this. Let me go this other way. And I think this does actually sound better. It ultimately comes down to, do we trust God's way is best, or do we think that our way is better? And I think this is, we see this playing out in a lot of different ways. All right. Another question came in here. Thank you for the questions. I love it. Considering the vast majority of people are not Christian, Christians have split heavily and consistently disagree on a fight over what the Bible and even Jesus says. Is God bad at communicating? No, I don't think so. And here's why. God is very, 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 very good at communicating the things that matter, the things that need to be believed, the things that need to be understood. He communicates really well, and I think very clearly. You look at it, Christianity is the largest religion in the world, with over 2 billion people believing in Christianity. And this is a message that has spread far and wide to tons of different cultures at all sorts of different places and everything. This is a widespread belief. It's not just only the intellectuals or only within America or only these sort of things. And what makes Christians Christian is the fact that we agree on the core essential Christian doctrines. And so if the idea that there's a God, that Jesus is God, that Jesus died and rose from the dead for the forgiveness of our sins, and the Bible being the word of God, I mean, that is the stuff that is key and central and necessary for salvation. And that stuff is clear, and all Christians agree on it. And if you don't, then you're not a Christian. I mean, that's what takes you outside the realms of Christianity. What Christians disagree on, you say Christians split heavily and constantly disagree and fight over what the Bible or even Jesus says. What we're disagreeing about is the things that ultimately don't matter for salvation. These are secondary and tertiary issues that we like to figure out. And I think it's important to figure out and discuss, but we all recognize, or at least should recognize as Christians, this is not gospel, right? Whether it's old earth or young earth, or whether it's Arminianism or Calvinism, or whether, it's pre-trib rapture or no rapture, amillennial, premillennial, whatever it may be, we recognize, like, yes, we're trying to figure out God's word. And hopefully the constantly disagreeing, and this came up in a Q&A I had last night, hopefully the constantly disagreeing it's an act of worship, right? If everything was just so clear that we never had to figure it out or discuss it or debate it or talk about it, I think that it would just easily get thrown off the table as like, okay, I don't need this anymore. I got it figured out. I think actually the fact that some of these things that, while not necessary for salvation, are not super clear and require us to dig deeper, I think that that is an act of love. In fact, I asked the group of, I was doing a Q&A at the Orange County Rescue Mission. I do it once a month, every fourth Monday. I was there last night. And I asked the group of students at the Orange County Rescue Mission, why isn't everything clear? And is that good or bad? And one student immediately said, I think that's a good thing, because it actually shows who wants to know God more. It's a relationship that takes work. And you have to put the work in, and you have to study, and you have to look, and you have to learn. It's kind of like my relationship with my wife. If I just knew everything instantly about my wife, and it's like, okay, then I think that would turn us to be lazy probably pretty easy. Instead, this is a relationship in which we should be working and learning and growing and understanding. And this is how we are when it's a relational thing. And so I don't think it's God bad at communicating. I think he communicated clearly the things that need to be understood clearly, and the things that didn't need to be understood, he didn't tell us clearly. And we as people are curious people. And so we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to dig deep. We're trying to study. We're trying to know, because we want answers to everything. And maybe some of them we can find answers to. And I think these would be secondary doctrines, and some are tertiary, where we're just kind of guessing. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I don't think that shows bad communication. At least that's my take on it. Perhaps he could drop some clarification so Christians fight less and know what God wants, while non-believers might be more convinced. Yeah, I don't know if non-believers would be more convinced. And here's my reasoning, is because the things that are super, super, super clear in Scripture, non-believers are not convinced of, right? The fact that all Christians recognize Jesus died and rose from the dead, or the fact that all Christians recognize God exists. Yet just because all Christians recognize that fact, there is a God, and there's no fighting in Christianity that there is a God. I don't see atheists going, well, the fact that Christians don't fight over this, then that is evidence that's real, and become more convinced. And again, hopefully as Christians, we do fight over stuff, and that's not great, and we shouldn't. But hopefully we are discussing and debating and trying to understand and recognizing at the end of the day, we're all followers of Jesus Christ. And this is we have different perspectives on this. Now, I've been called horrible things by Christians here on YouTube. I've been called a blind guide, a false teacher, leading people to the pit of hell, because I reject things like baptismal regeneration, which says that you have to be baptized in order to be saved. I don't think that's true. But because I reject that one view, I've been told I'm a blind guide, a false teacher, and leading people to the pit of hell. That's taking it too far. That's not what we as Christians should do. But I think that people who believe in baptismal regeneration and those who don't should be able to sit down and have good, thoughtful, respectful conversations as we try to understand the best we can. What does Scripture teach? Do you have to be baptized or not? So hopefully that is the goal. I'm not convinced that if it was clearer that more people would believe, because there's some things that are very clear that are still rejected. All right. I appreciate the questions. I haven't seen you here before. Thanks for coming. So that is kind of the central core. The Christian worldview is not merely a set of propositions, but a prescriptive on life that flows out of our friendship with a personal God whose love writes our story. Then there is an aspect of the Christian worldview. I guess I'm going to go a little bit longer with this because I'm taking questions as I'm going. But if you have calls, call in. I'd love to chat with you. If you have more questions, put them in the live chat. There is a part of Christian worldview is the way we are. The first part is recognizing that there's a creator-creation distinction, that there is a creator of the universe and there is a creation, and that I am not the creator. I am not the one in charge. He says, if the universe is what it is without anyone behind it, then there is no ultimate purpose for anything or any transcendent basis for making moral distinctions. This is exactly the conversation with Mirza last week. If there is no creator, then there is no transcendent basis for making moral distinctions between right and wrong. Therefore, it's just our value system and just our opinion based on our circumstance. Versus the Christian worldview says, no, there is a creator who created us. He is the transcendent standard, and then we can judge things and base things off of him. And so part of the worldview of Christianity is knowing God and then knowing ourselves, that we are created. We are made in his image. Yes, use the guest link to call in at the top. It says guest eCam. Click on that, and then you should be able to call in here. One thing I just want to address this as well is knowing who we are, and the way that we are is that God has made us like himself so that we can hear him, know him, love him, worship him, and serve him. And part of this is then glorifying God. And I love this section of this chapter of what does it look like to glorify God? And he says, our real worldview is not merely the ones we say we believe, but the ones we actually live in the world, right? Your worldview is not just what you say you think, but actually how you live. That is what is the worldview that you have. And he says one of the catechisms, in fact, my kids have learned this catechism. My not yet 2-year-old, my youngest son turns 2 next month. So he's not even 2 yet. And he can answer these 3 questions. Catechism question number 1, who made you? He goes, God. What else did God make? He goes, all things. God made all things. Why did God make you and all things? And his answer is for his own glory. And we recognize this is why God made everything, is for his glory, to recognize who he truly is. These questions are simple enough, even for the smallest child to learn, he says. Yes, my not yet 2-year-old has learned them. And yet anyone who knows the answer is well on the way to knowing the Christian worldview. All we need to do now is to extend the goal of glorifying God to every aspect of life. In what ways can we glorify God? And here's a few, and I love these, and I'll maybe stop here and I'll take the calls or further questions. There's a lot more that could be discussed. In what ways can we glorify God? Number one, we glorify God with our praise, worshiping the Creator rather than anything in His good creation. Augustine said, "You stir man to take pleasure in praising you because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Number two, he says, we glorify God with our bodies. The doctrine of creation affirms the goodness of the human body and it's desired as designed and manufactured by God. And so how we live and how we act, rather than trying to escape our bodies, is actually recognizing our bodies are created by God, and how we use our eyes and our ears and our hands and our feet and our mouths these are all instruments that God has given us to serve and glorify Him. This also then recognizes the inherent goodness of our bodies, including our sexuality. And we see this in Genesis 1:28, that God created everything good and then said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. The doctrine of creation then also affirms the beauty of marriage. And here's what I thought was interesting. Actually, this is not the part. But he says the biblical ethic for sexuality does not come from some arbitrary degree or a human invention, but from the very structure of creation itself. Here's a big distinction between a Christian and a secular view when it comes to sexual ethics, is that in a secular view, if there is no God who created us to be a certain way, then our ethical system is just by our own human invention on what we like and what we don't. And the question ultimately is then, why do you draw the line where you draw it? Why not draw it somewhere else? Why is someone who draws it different in a different place? Why are they wrong? But from a Christian perspective, it is from creation itself, how God designed us to be. And because of this, we also recognize that God created us to be in community, that it's not good for us to be alone. That's why one of the worst ways you can punish people is to make them go alone. God created us as relational beings. We recognize that we glorify God in our work. Work has given to Adam before the fall. Work is not a bad thing. Work is a good thing. There was a part here I thought was so good, and it's probably somewhere else. And so we have this creation mandate of how God has called us and created us to be, that should inform the way that we see the world, of who we are, how God has made us, as we as the creator, we are the creature. This should inform our values, as we're made in the image of God, form our relationships, form how we form community, form how we see people in terms of sexual morality and in marriage and all of these issues. And that should then influence our behaviors. We also recognize that the doctrine of creation calls us to enjoy nature. It gives us a basis for investigating nature and the natural world through science. Far from conflicting with science, creation makes science possible by establishing an orderly universe in which sense perception gives us trustworthy information about what is really there. This is why Johannes Kepler believed that by studying nature, by doing science, we were thinking God's thoughts after him. The science is a gift from God that gives us much opportunity, as theology does, to know the mind of our maker. And so that is understanding, here's why we are the way we are. And going back to a doctrine of creation radically shapes the Christian worldview. All right. So if you wanted to call in, I'm not seeing your call here. You should be able to click it. I'll give you a second if you wanted to. I don't see other questions jumping in. So if I don't see questions and I don't see calls, then I can jump forward as quickly as I can. But again, we have doctrine of creation. Second part of the Christian story then is the fall. So we have creation. There's a creator. God is central. He's revealed himself to us. Here's how he's made us to be. Then we have what he calls paradise lost, that we fell into sin. And so part of the biblical worldview is recognizing the sinful fallenness of humanity. And that's why part of the worldview questions with the Gen Z study is, if you believe that we are good people and can earn our own way to heaven, then it's falling outside the biblical worldview, because the biblical worldview says that sin has brought alienation from God. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. And so therefore we are not these good people. Now, let me go through this. I thought this was really fascinating. How has sin brought alienation? One thing this author addresses here is that virtually all worldviews recognize that there is alienation, that there is a problem with humanity. There are problems between us. And he then argues that sin and the fallen state, as described in Scripture, is the best explanation for why we are broken and why we are the way that we are. that we find ourselves, everyone recognizes this, we find ourselves estranged from one another. And he argues that Adam launched the first assaults on his estranged wife as soon as sin happened. Adam then blames Eve. It was her, the woman you gave me. Instantly, the moment sin happened, now there's an estrangement between the relationships, and he now blames her for eating that fruit. We often, and what is the problem with us? Worldviews say, well, here's the problem from a Christian view. We excuse our sin by saying it was someone else's fault. And so we recognize there's discord, there is disharmony at every level of human relationships. And he walks through that. There's estrangement is common in the home, where husbands are angry or unfaithful, wives are critical or judgmental. There's far too many marriages that end in divorce. Children disobey their parents, while parents exasperate their children. The elderly are killed in the name of mercy, while the unborn are never seen the light of day. There's also estrangement in the church, where each group claims to have God on its side and looks down on people who do not think and worship and serve the way that they do. There's estrangement in society, where men and women wage an endless battle of the sexes, often to the disadvantage and exploitation of women. There's estrangement in the workplace, where competitors use and abuse others to get ahead in their careers, where corporate greed claims excessive profits off the backs of ordinary employees out of the pocketbooks of helpless investors. Bosses abuse their power and workers rise up in rebellion. We see the same thing in the wider economy, where exploitation is so woven in the fabric of the global marketplace that the poor are often enmeshed in the cords of injustice. There's estrangement around the globe, especially in the form of armed conflict. Nations rise against nation, the tribe against tribe. Dictators oppress their own people. Terrorists commit random acts of violence, and the superpowers provide weapons that fuel the fires of war. We are not guided by love, but held captive to hatred. Wow, that's powerful. And then he says, Christianity offers the most accurate explanation for all of these broken relationships by calling it sin, that we are depraved, that we are corrupt. The sin that we have, he writes, corrupts our feelings so that we are in emotional turmoil. It corrupts our wills so that we will not choose the good. Our whole nature is corrupted by sin. This is what theologians mean when they speak of total depravity. Not that we are as sinful as we could possibly be, but that we are sinners through and through. Our thinking is damaged. It's damaging by our depravity, even when it comes to our interpretation of Scripture, where Christians can get it wrong. The question is this: can other worldviews address this the same? I was talking, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I was at on a Maven trip in Colorado, and we had a Unity pastor come speak to our group, and he believed he's pantheistic. This is new thought, pantheism, that God is everything, God is love, that every human being has a spark of divinity within them, and that our thoughts literally can create reality and heal diseases, and there is no bad. It's just negative thinking. And he brought it up. This is it. We're in Boulder, Colorado 2 weeks ago. This is like a week after the attack in Boulder, where the man threw Molotov cocktails into the group of Jewish people who were there praying. And it was like, was that wrong? And he was unwilling to say that was wrong. Because he goes, the moment we say something is wrong, we act like we have some sort of outside perspective, and now we are judging, like as if we have a true way to view this. Versus, no, we are all God. God is love. We all have the spark of divinity within us, and we are just called to love and spread peace and share and these sort of things. What he's saying, I'm like, man, that is a really broken worldview. A worldview that cannot call evil evil is evil. Is it just my opinion that I don't like what he did, or is what he did actually wrong? And so I think one thing is interesting here is within these different ways of understanding it, he says the doctrine of sin explains the greater evils of the world as depravity works in its way into the structures of society. It's not only personal. Sin is not just personal, but it's communal. It's communal. And thus its influence is pervasive. And so the question is, how do other worldviews do at explaining what's broken about us? What's wrong? Is it just I haven't learned enough? If I just learn a little bit better, then everything gets better? Or is there something that is this deeply broken about us? Question here came in. Again, if you want to try to use that link and call in, I would love to chat with you. Can a different worldview explain this? I mean, if you go with a naturalistic view, the conflict is competition, limited resources, and egoism. With also empathy is exactly what we'd expect. So and that's where I would just have a hard time. Is that really all it is? Is it simply just competition? Is it just limited resources? So if we just had all the resources, everything would get better. If we weren't, or would there still be this drive to take, even if it's not limited? It's like, is it just competition? Just take away all competition, have equal ownership, kind of move into this kind of a state of everyone shares everything. And that's interesting. You try calling in, it's just loading. I don't know why. I don't know how to fix the calling feature. I can try to create a new link, or I can post the link again. Let me see if a new link works. Let me try to reset the link, create a new link. All right, here's a new link. I'll put it in the chat. Let's see if this works. When we see the brokenness, I think at all levels, yes, there are other ways that worldviews try to explain it, but I think the biggest part of a naturalistic view is going to be its understanding. Oh, that works. Great. I think the biggest part of a naturalistic view is to say, look, this is just that we're not cooperating. That's what it is. And if we would just cooperate and if we could just agree together, then the problem would go away. And because there's not an inherent connection of morality to law, it's what we decide is law, and there's not actually objective right and wrong. So it's not objectively wrong that we do this. It just kind of goes against society's standards. So we just need to change society and we can cooperate better. And so yes, it is true that we can create rules and there's ways that we can cooperate better and have less competition and less fighting and society gets better. But if we're getting better, then that is assuming that there's a best. There's assuming that there's a way in which we ought to be, that there's a way in which we ought to behave, and there's actually objective values that we should be striving for. And to go against those objective values is be doing what is wrong. And so I have a hard time seeing how a secular view makes sense of that sort of standard by which we can actually judge what is wrong in society versus what is right, and calling something evil. So see that you are in the green room. So let me remove you from the green room and the show. Can you hear me?
Hey, hello. Ryan, right?
Yeah, Ryan, good to meet you. What's on your mind?
Sorry, I don't have an actual working camera set up. Yeah, my name's Carl, so my voice will have to do for now.
No problem. Normally when I have guests call in, I don't bring up their video anyways. I had some, a long time ago, I had someone, I think, show something inappropriate or do something that was about to be. And so I just go audio only for now.
Oh yeah, fair. No, I like discussion and just philosophy, especially recently been looking into a lot of things in detail, like the Kalam and other stuff like that. When it comes to explaining things with the secular worldview, I suppose without a god or anything particular, we'd expect a competition. And of course, since there are limited resources of many types, like land, food, safety, partners, luxuries, that's to be expected. You said that if all those things were gone, I understand. Like if you're wondering if the conflict would disappear.
Well, I guess the question for me would be, I think that we can say, yeah, if there's no stuff, then there will be no one fighting over stuff. And so that seems to be better because we're not fighting. And so there's less fighting. But ultimately what this is recognizing, or I think what it assumes, that there's a way in which things ought to be. There's a way in which things should be, and therefore to function according to that would be good, and to go against that would be bad. And so the question is, within a secular view, if there is no God, how do we determine this sort of transcendent objective standard about how we should be, to which we can judge a society as being a bad society and say this would be better?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've been I have a morally objective view, I suppose. I believe there's an objective morality, and do my best to try to figure it out and act by it when my egotistical wishes don't overwhelm that. For me, that would be a utilitarian perspective, where we look at human suffering and well-being, try to maximize human well-being and minimize the suffering, right? I mean, yeah, utilitarianism. As you say, the basis can be difficult, right? Because you need a starting point. If you take any assumption, like if you make the assumption, for example, human well-being as a moral good, from there on, you don't really need anything supernatural to get working on how can we best set up society to make sure everyone, is happy, isn't being tortured, isn't killing each other, right? Uh, the establishment of the objective base is, yeah, like difficult, as you might expect. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't want to ramble on for too long. Let you answer for a moment.
Well, yeah. So would you identify as an atheist, or what are your views on the existence of God?
Yeah, for now, absolutely. Was
Okay.
was raised Christian and eventually kind of moved away from it. Nothing
Okay.
too bad. My life has been fine.
Yeah.
Just ended up unconvinced in that direction of anything supernatural.
Sure. Okay. So with that in mind, then, if there is no God, what actually makes human flourishing an objective good?
So, the way I have approached it is to think of morality as something like math. Um, an objective truth that's not decided by authority or anything like that. It's also not subjective. So if I believe it's one way and you believe it's the other, one of us is actually correct. Even if many people may passionately believe one thing or another, doesn't necessarily mean they're right. For a actual basis, one I've kind of recently gone with is to look at a pre-moral setup. If you look at things like animals, children, uh, people with mental disabilities or psychopaths, arguably, what we see is behavior that's egotistical. The focus is on the consequence of yourself and no one else. We occasionally see selective altruism, where sometimes animals will consider specifically the consequences for a specific other group, but I would then argue that if the pre-moral state has this focus on consequences for yourself merely, or occasionally specific others, then an upgrade to a more human sentient state would be to elevate that to considering the consequences for everyone involved. That's kind of one approach I'm taking to it.
Okay. Would your approach? Would you argue that that approach could actually give us moral duties, like objective
Mm,
moral
I,
duties, to where, like, can you actually get the ought from the is? This, if this is the way it's true, now why ought I follow that? Do I actually have objective duties of things I should and should not do based on that, or that would just be some sort of built-in value?
yeah, do you know Sam Harris by any
Hmm.
chance, or any of his philosophy?
Yeah.
Yeah, he goes kind of about it of like in the Abraham Lincoln sense of if this isn't wrong, nothing is. If you just kind of picture the worst possible misery and suffering for everyone at all time, um, that if you can at least acknowledge that as an ought bad kind of, right,
Yeah.
then you'd have some basis. If you, it's suppose it's possible to treat it all as descriptive instead of prescriptive, right? I understand that. But by the way we use language and what we associate with the words good and bad in our human just experience, I would definitely argue that there's points where we can argue for a prescriptive morality. Yeah.
So, and I would agree with you that there's ways that we can argue for prescriptive. What I have a hard time seeing myself, and I'm curious if you have a solution to this, is where do we get prescriptive morality without a prescriber? Right? We recognize that we can have prescriptive laws when authority creates a law and says, here's what you have to do. Now there's a prescription and you have a moral obligation to follow. But if there is not a prescriber, God, within a secular framework, if there is no God, where do these prescriptive laws come from, and why ought I follow them?
I'm gonna go to the comparison I made earlier, to the comparison to math. So 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? That is a descriptive fact,
Right.
right? Um, But if I were to ask you, or if the question is 2 plus 2 and you were looking for the correct answer, then you ought to answer 4, right? It's not merely a description at that point when you're looking for the answer. And that's a similar approach I would take when it comes to morality, that the the way our world exists with us and our conscious experience in a 2 plus 2 type of sense leads to the morality. I believe it to be a specific way. I could be completely wrong with that, right? The important part here that I would try to establish is that the 2 plus 2 equals 4 setup, right?
Okay.
Basis. I wanted to ask for you because I think your basis can be similar. When you say you put it to God, right? Objective morality comes from God, the prescriptive aspect. Do you think that is a goodness? This is Plato's question, right? Do you think it's a goodness made by his authority, by his power, or is it because he knows what is objectively good?
So I would split the dilemma and say because he is good. And so it's not a standard of goodness outside of him that he knows, and it's not completely arbitrary on whatever he prescribes, but him as a perfectly good and loving being, his good prescriptions and his good commands then flow from his perfectly good nature.
I've heard that, but I feel like it just delays the question. Did he decide his nature, or is his nature and what the goodness of his nature is an inevitability of him
His his
existing as a god?
his nature is a fact of his. It's one of his characteristics. It's one of his attributes, is that he is perfectly good. And so it's not
And he
something that
couldn't
God
have been any
decided.
different.
I don't
It
think
couldn't
so.
have been any different. Yeah.
Correct.
Which would suggest that there is similar to a math sense where he couldn't have decided it to be 4. That, and for example, if we say, I don't know, God is truth, I'm not sure if you believe that as well,
Yeah.
but he also didn't pick that. But the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is just a truth. And so if his nature and what is considered good is an inevitable fact just from reality, right? Then it would suggest that this would be the case even if he did not exist.
Why would it be the case if he didn't exist? Because if he didn't exist, then there would not be a perfectly good nature to ground goodness, and therefore it would just be based on the preference and opinions of people, which is generally a secular view of moral relativism.
Yeah, what's the right way to phrase this since it's all very abstract? So perhaps think of God as 4 here. God is the answer. God is the correct answer. He is the truth in this case, right?
Okay.
But for that to be the case, 2 plus 2 and the rules of math must apply. And so if the rules of math apply, then 2 plus 2 would also equal 4, even if God himself were not there to be 4. If my analogy falls apart,
I guess I
that's
would say
fine.
if God wasn't there, then there wouldn't be the answer. If his good nature does not exist, then you do not have anything by which you can compare actions against, and therefore it becomes arbitrary if there is no standard. It's like if there are no rules to a game, then there's no right
Mhm.
or wrong actions in the game. You don't have an action or a choice in a game that is a right choice if there are no rules. It's only based upon the rules that you can now know right and wrong choices.
Yeah, for that I would of course disagree with the analogy, but so you think he kind of works also by example? Is that kind of
Well, we do have the
the
example of
core?
Jesus. Yes, I think it's based on what he tells us, who he is, what he tells us, and then the example of Jesus that I think we learn these sort of moral commands. Um,
Hmm.
can I go back because there's something you said there for a second and that aligns
Sure.
with a different question I had that I've been kind of holding on to. When I use the analogy of the sports game, what about that analogy
Yeah.
did you not like? That if there are no rules, so if I'm inventing a sport and I have no rules, well then there's no right or wrong action to do. It's only when there's a rule book that says you can't touch the ball with your hands, you have to only kick it with your feet. You now have a right and wrong actions within the game once there's a rule book. But if there's no rule book, if there's no rules to a game, then kind of you're free to do whatever you want, make up your house rules because there's no actual rules. What about that analogy would you disagree with in saying, is it possible at least in some way, that similar would be with God, is if there's no rule giver, God, then what we do becomes up to our own opinions on however we want to believe and act, since there's no rule giver.
Yeah, for me in the comparison, the sport, like take, I don't know, say chess as the game here, right? That the rules are more like the math part here that are just a given, and God would not be the rules of the game, but more like the correct opening to play, the AI that knows which move to make, the correct answer that can only be gotten through omniscience, perhaps, but not necessarily needed to play the game well.
Okay, I'm trying to follow that a little bit. So this leads to my second question, and here's why I think the math, since you mentioned math again, that I was ultimately thinking through and trying to understand your view of, is I don't think that describing morality in the terms of math and simply having a right answer, I don't think that accurately reflects what we perceive to be true about moral actions in society. And what I mean by that is, going now back to our sports analogy, is you said, well, yeah, you can get an ought from how things should be. So 2 + 2 = 4. That's a true answer. But now if you want to get the right answer, you ought to put 4. And this is similar like in chess, right? In chess, well, here's the moves and here's the goal of the game. And so based on that, here's how you ought to move your pieces in order to win the game. And so now there becomes a little bit of an ought that is built in on here's how you ought to move if you want to win. The issue, I think, with that analogy and how that compares about our perception of morality and culture is there's no moral
figuring out the win condition.
Well, it's not just the win condition, but there's no moral component. We're talking about good and bad in a strategic sense, or a getting the right answer sense, or a winning sense, not good and bad in a moral sense. And so if I put 5 on
was only because of the sports analogy, right? I would say
sure,
getting
or
the right
chess.
answer, getting
But
the
if
right
I
answer
put
can still apply if we
put
phrase it as a moral question, right?
Good, but if I put 5 on a math test, the teacher's going to say that's wrong. But I'm not. Did I do something immoral?
No, not there,
Okay,
right?
good. So that's where I would say,
in the normal situation, math isn't a moral question. In the comparison, where the 2 and the 4 aren't numbers but moral aspects, like, I don't know, kids tied up on a train track, and you have to do the equals of 4 is your answer. Do I switch the trolley? Then yes, it becomes a moral or immoral answer.
okay, good. So I think that's what I see that as a distinction, is that we recognize when we look in society that there are actual moral oughts, right? That kids tied up on a train track or punching the teacher in the face, that is actually an immoral thing, versus putting a wrong answer is not immoral. And so I think the ought that you get from a math equation by saying, well, you ought to put 4 if you want the right answer, that is purely speaking of good and bad in a strategic sense, or a trying to get the right answer sense. But that's not the same as what we see in culture of actually having a moral sense, where there's an immoral right or wrong, where people are getting arrested and punished and judged based on doing wrong, which is, you wouldn't get, it's not immoral to shoot the basketball in the wrong hoop, so to speak. And so it just goes against the strategy of the game. And so the question is, if that's what we recognize to be true of morality, that there's an actual moral and immoral action, and there's moral oughts, how do we get moral oughts if everything is simply just a math equation, which doesn't produce moral oughts, but only strategic oughts? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. Partly it's unfortunate because we have the concepts that we're truly talking about also exist in the world of the analogy, and then we may conflate the two. Like, for example, with the math question on the test, of course, it's not immoral to answer 5 on the test, right? Yeah. Overall, it's difficult. I'm aware of that because I can very confidently argue for assuming just one base assumption of a moral aspect of human well-being or experience. From there, I can relatively consistently map out the answer to many moral questions that one might have, like, is murder wrong? Is rape wrong? Is stealing wrong? Is theft wrong? Should you pull the trolley lever? Right. The full basis is difficult because it feels somewhat baseless in a way, even if you extend it and say that a god said so.
So, so would that be? I'm curious. Would that be one of your main objections against a Christian view? Is because I would argue in a sense that, like, okay, how do we best explain our moral awareness that we have? And I would say, well, in secularism, I see a very baseless view. There is not a foundation in which we can, I think, adequately explain the moral awareness that we have. And I think that Christianity does explain it really well, where if God is good and he exists and he and all things are judged according to his perfectly good nature, is right or wrong, and he is love and we're called to love, therefore not loving is wrong, therefore we can actually have a standard by which we can judge and evaluate these moral actions. And when he has said you should love your neighbor as yourself, love me and love your neighbor, there's now a moral ought that we have. And so I think that Christianity actually provides a foundation for which we can then explain the moral sense awareness that we have in our world. What would be your main objection to
Yeah.
using Christianity as that foundation?
Yeah, so I think you kind of went in the wrong direction here, because how things are, we're back in the descriptive, and there the secular path can describe it very accurately without a problem, right? We can say that we have, for example, empathy aspects of our nature, and we have the logical aspect, so that explaining why we act in moral ways or why we come to them or care for each other, right? I think that's very simple. The odd problem is
So that's, and
like
I think
the
that's,
bigger one.
so that's what I would say is when I say we have an awareness of how things are, I wouldn't be just simply saying people act this certain way. I would say we have an awareness that there is actual right and wrong,
Hmm.
and that we
We
have a
perceive it to
moral,
be so. Yeah.
yeah, and we have a moral obligation to do that which is good and stop that which is evil. And I think that's
Hmm.
what we are aware of, that there are actually objective moral values and objective moral duties. And then the question is what worldview can actually ground and provide a foundation for the objective moral values and duties that we perceive in the world. Now, the other,
Yeah,
and I'm
I
happy
agree,
to,
of course, with the first
okay,
part, right?
yeah.
I agree, of course, with the objective moral part, right? As I mentioned before, others may have more relativist or subjective perspectives
Yeah.
on that, right?
So let me ask you a couple questions. So since you just mentioned you agree on the objective part and your view was a utilitarianism, which is pursuing the greatest good for the greatest number of people, I think number one is saying, well, why is that the good that we should pursue versus why not a ethico-egoism? Why not a moral skepticism? Why not pragmaticism? Why not hedonism? Why not all of these other moral theories that people have created? So why utilitarianism is one question. And then why ought I follow utilitarianism? Yes, I can say, yeah, well, that would create the greatest good for the greatest number of people. True. That is what would be true. The question is now,
Hmm.
that moral obligation that we get from that. So that would be the first thing that I would kind of have a question or challenge with accepting myself. The second thing I would be curious to get your
Sure.
view on, and we've already talked about that, so I'm just kind of summarizing. The second thing I'd be
Hmm.
curious to get your view on is I think one of the problems with utilitarianism, which kind of falls under the category of a teleological ethic, which is an ethic based on an end goal or an end result. And so what is the end goal? What is the purpose? The greatest good for the
Hmm.
greatest number of people. And then we decide it, is it's very difficult, or we are not always able to accurately predict the end result
Hmm.
of any of our thoughts and actions. So
Yeah.
what I think at this moment would produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and then I make that choice, sometimes turns out that actually my choice was wrong. I was wrong, and I actually just caused a whole bunch of harm. So within a utilitarian ethic, my question would be, would you agree that we are not always able to accurately predict it? And then if so, well, actually, let me just say it really quickly. Would you agree that we are not able to always accurately predict the end result of our thoughts and actions?
Of course.
Okay.
But that fits perfectly within the framework, right? Because the counter argument you're supposed kind of making here is that the consequences within the framework are bad for the people, but that's or sometimes at least, but that's the whole goal of the system, right? So if we say, okay, our goal is the well-being of people, and we are aware that sometimes, due to our flawed ability to predict consequences, right, we will fail at that. Um, but that is a problem in execution. So ironically, an omniscient, omnipotent being would be the perfect utilitarian because it would not have that limitation, right? But
Yeah.
the
So I think,
limitation of how well we can implement that and the prediction of consequences for moral results is a thing that generally all moral theories struggle with to some degree.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
think my challenge would be this: is if this view is true, and we are
Hmm.
aware that we are not able to accurately predict the ends of our thoughts and actions, then
Hmm.
then we are not able to actually know if what we are about to do is right or wrong, because we cannot know for certain if it's actually going to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people or not. And so then the
True.
question is, how can we have any sort of confidence in moral knowledge before we do an action if we don't know how that action is going to actually turn out? And so if we claimed actually can have moral knowledge, if I know this is wrong, um, then it seems to be a utilitarian ethic is not a good foundation for actually providing true moral knowledge or certainty regarding moral knowledge before an action is committed. And I think then this then hinges on that third problem I think I have with the utilitarian ethic, is that we know that there are actions like murdering or stealing or lying that might actually have good intentions and might actually produce good outcomes. But yet we would still say they're wrong. And so you could
Yeah,
say, yeah,
so one
murdering
thing
this
at a time
person
here.
would create a greater good for the greater number of people, but we still say, well, isn't murder still wrong? And so, but this has then led to a lot of people, and I'll finish this, sorry, really quick, is it, with the view that the ends justify the means. That if it's just a good end, then that justifies whatever means that we take to get there. And this would be the result of a utilitarian ethic. But we know that this has resulted in some of the world's greatest evils of people arguing that what they did was okay or good because it produced a good result. And we would generally say, no, the ends do not justify the means. Just because it produced a
Oh,
great good result doesn't mean how you get there is good.
I mean, even in that point, your argument there was it that the end result was bad for many people, right? Which would, in that case, the problem there not being the aspect of trying to lead to good for most people, but just a failure at executing it, right?
Well, no, I would say if it did
So
result in a good result, if an action, put it this way, do you think there's ever a time in which an immoral, wrong action can produce a good outcome that actually produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people?
yes, because it's a comparison thing, right? People make the thing of do the ends justify the means, but what's easy to forget and what's very important is that the means are part of the ends. So if you kill a person for the well-being to save two, for example, that one person dead is still part of the ends. That's still part of the consequences, right? And when you make, let's say, sacrifices. So when you have moral choices, it's always a limited amount of options, right? You can't freely choose the consequences or the state. And of course, you will have scenarios where there is no option that is only good, and maybe there are only options that are in the net negative, right? But I would argue, it would still be your moral obligation to choose the option that leads to the least suffering, right? So the trolley problem is the classic here, right? Uh,
Yeah, so there's
I
the
assume
trolley
you know it,
problem.
right?
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, the trolley problem with, yeah, the trolley's going and there's four people on one track and there's one on the other. Do you pull the lever? And what is
Yeah.
obligation that we have? Again, I think that assumes things like human value and assumes things that there is a
Hmm.
right and
Hmm.
wrong to debate and discuss. I guess
Yes.
my challenge or my issue that's always I've always had with a utilitarian ethic, if that is the only foundation that we have,
Hmm.
then if what we choose to do does produce the greatest good for the greatest
Hmm.
number of people, so if it is the
Hmm.
greatest good end result, then
Hmm.
that is how we determine whether an action was good or bad, right?
Yeah. if the intent and the predicted outcome, right? So if you shoot somebody because you wanted to, and this would be fun, but the gun misfired, and you actually shot somebody who turned out to be a rapist, that does not make it a moral action, right? The predicted consequences from your side. So if you think you're killing people, that's a negative consequence. If you're trying to do something good sincerely with predictably good consequences, but out of bad luck it turns really bad, that would still be not an evil action. So that's part of something to keep in mind with utilitarianism. It's not just what actually turns out, right? But what was predictable to turn out.
Okay. But the question is, if I intended to, let's say, kill someone, and that actually was the greatest good for the greatest number of people, then that killing of that person would be good.
Situationally, yes. I personally would always say to keep in mind that it's not a pure like adding and subtracting thing where we take all the negatives and we add all the positives, and if the end sum is a positive number, then it's good, right? But to keep it separate, so we have the negatives and we have the positives. So for example, let's say you shoot a guy who was trying to detonate a nuke, just something random here, right? Where it would be a negative to have killed that person, and you would also have the positive of the save lives of a couple million people, compared to the alternative where you didn't, and there you have, I don't know, 2 million dead people, but that person at least is alive. So in that case, in a way, it is the right answer, I would argue, to shoot the person. It is your moral obligation even to do so, and it would be immoral not to. But of course, the person's death is still just innately a negative thing, as one person, still has value just because many others are involved. That doesn't change that.
So within that view, then, kind of going back to our first conversation, is where would you get the moral obligation to shoot that person? Why just for strategic results? It's just to produce the end result in a strategic sense, not necessarily that was a moral action of right and wrong, but more strategy just to get the results that you need and get the results that you want. Kind of like what we discussed, the problem between math and wrong answers versus immoral answers. Is that how you look at it?
That's kind of bouncing back, right? So then we would not be, previously in your statement, we were making the assumption of utilitarian, or making the assumption of an ought there, right? Going back to the is it an is or an ought is kind of, is separate, right? Yeah. I would be curious, for example, with the nuclear detonation gun scenario, what would you say is the moral action to take?
I think that's a good question. So here's how I would briefly summarize. I think that what we've been talking about here, just for everyone who's listening, is there's different ethical theories that are called teleological ethics, which is ethics based on kind of just figuring out what is the good life and then trying to achieve that. Utilitarianism would be one. Then on a different category would be like a deontological ethic. And that is the question of what ought we do, and that there's a moral ought, and this is what you should do no matter if you want to or not. The challenge with a deontological ethic is that when there are conflicts between ethical absolutes, right? And so the common example is you're hiding Jews and it is wrong to lie versus it's wrong to kill innocent people. And so what do you tell the Nazi guard who show up at your door and says, are you hiding Jews? Do you say, well, I have to tell the truth and say yes, and now they get killed, but you're supposed to protect innocent life? Or do you lie and do something wrong? And that's where I think that there is a challenge. And how do we deal with this? But it only comes from the fact that it only comes from within a deontological ethical framework, I think. That if there's actually ethical absolutes that have moral oughts tied in, now I have the problem of when these oughts come into conflict with each other that I don't have if it is moral relativism or simply a teleological ethical theory of just the end result. Because then I just say, well, what's the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Well, clearly it's saying, no, I'm not hiding Jews, and you save a whole bunch of lives and you tell one little lie and that lie is justified. Instead, I would say we have a little bit more of a difficulty because I hold to more of a deontological theory. And I think that Christianity actually, to kind of, summarize, I think that Christianity actually is kind of, it's neither purely deontological or teleological. I think it actually combines these really well, where there are actions that have moral weight tied into them. There are objective moral oughts that we have to do, but also when we do that, it will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and it will produce a life of flourishing and these sort of end goal results as well. And so I think it doesn't fit clearly into either the teleological or deontological categories, but it helps us resolve the dilemma. So I would say, for example, the highest obligation that we have is to obey God. And so when it comes to like the Nazi guard,
divine command theory type thing, right?
So not necessarily just divine command theory, but my moral obligation is to love God first, and to obey God. And so if the Nazis came to my door and said, "Are you hiding Jews?" I would actually argue. Some people say, well, what is the lesser of two evils? All right, so you have two different evils, two conflicting obligations, and so which one is lesser? And the lying is a lesser evil than protecting innocent human life, and so that's why you choose to protect innocent human life. My response would be, my first and foremost, my obligation is to God. Obey God, not man. And so God is actually calling me to protect life, and therefore I can lie to or deceive the Nazi government because they're an evil government trying to destroy. And so therefore I'm choosing not to follow them. I'm following God instead. And that means to lie to them. Some people argue that they don't deserve the truth. They're not owed the truth. And so then that is a way to kind of get around the problem as well. Now, your example of shooting someone who's about to bomb a bunch of people. Now I think this though falls into categories of like just war theory, which is saying this is now in an act of self-defense. And so it's not simply just a utilitarian, what's the greatest good for the greatest number, but saying, hey, this person is actually going to kill a whole bunch of people. And so we are stopping a threat. And therefore it is no longer murder, which is the unjustified killing of an innocent human being, but this is actually stopping a threat, which we are called to do in order to protect life. And so I don't see killing the person in that case to be immoral, just as I don't see all killing to be immoral.
Yeah, I mean, I can rephrase that. I can rephrase that into just like a big trolley problem, right? Where you could switch the trolley to kill one person to save, I don't know, 1,000 people, right? In this case, the person you would be killing is innocent and is not at all responsible. The utilitarian would still pull the trigger, but now you don't have the excuse of saying it's self-defense for the deontological side.
Yeah, and the deontological side says, look, you have. I mean, this is the problem that's presented is, and we're discussing it because you believe that, as you say, in objective morality, to the person who's a relativist, I mean, this isn't a problem at all. Do kind of what you want or make your own rules or live out your own values, so to speak. This trolley problem and really moral dilemmas are only dilemmas if there's actually objective morality. And so I think that this is a conversation. I think the conversation that we're only having because we both recognize that there are objective moral values, that these humans laying on the trolley tracks are actually objectively valuable human beings, that we have a moral duty to try to protect. And therefore, there's a difficult choice that we have, whether you pull the lever or not, because we actually have the goal of protecting innocent human life that is valuable. I don't understand how we get to that conclusion if secularism is true. If there is no God and we are byproducts of evolution, how do we get this objective moral values of human life and human dignity and human worth and the moral obligation to protect those lives without a moral lawgiver and without humans being created in the image of God?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of I cannot speak for the relativists or emotivists or depending on what I cannot I don't know the ideology well enough to say they because I'm pretty sure a lot of them still argue in these moral conflicts. So I'm guessing there's aspects of that ideology that do include, but actually yes, we can argue here or we should or not, right? But I can't speak for that. For the odd thingy again, if we don't grant it for a bit, then we can't really continue the discussion much. I would argue for ask on your side, since we mentioned the divine command, and your kind of the number one duty deontology for you would be obeying God. Um, if you what if in the Nazi scenario you're the Nazi, not the person hiding the Jews, but you have received. We can do two scenarios: one where you simply perceive the command, and one a hypothetical where it's actually the true command. Would you then be the Nazi? Would it then be moral for you to follow the command and kill those Jews because God said so? Or is it too much in conflict with what he says at other times?
So are you asking if I perceived God to give me a command to kill Jews, would I then
Yeah,
have an
like
obligation to go do that?
for example, yeah, that is one of the two questions. Yes.
So I would just say this. If I had a feeling like God was telling me to do that, I would be extremely skeptical and I probably wouldn't follow it because
Hmm.
I would assume because it does contradict how God has called us to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us and all that kind of stuff that we see in the
Hmm.
teachings of Jesus. I would question whether I'm actually hearing God accurately or not. Now, there's clearly times in the Old Testament where God commanded the Israelites to do something. What I would argue, though, in those
Kill
cases,
your son.
I think that was, well, you know what? It's interesting with Abraham and Isaac is that was extremely common. Child sacrifice at that time was common to where Isaac did like it was like, oh yeah, that's what all the other gods require too, and so it was just not even weird to him. And so yeah, sure, I'll do that to show my allegiance to you. And God obviously knowing what would happen,
It's
knew that He
it's
would provide
odd.
an escape. Um,
It's odd that the moral, like you have a moral test situation where the authority, or the person asks you to, like, I don't know, kill a child to prove your loyalty or your goodness, and the correct answer is to actually do it instead of saying, I don't know, you're a God of love. I don't want to kill my kid, and then God is like, yeah, that's the moral answer or something. It seems,
well,
yeah.
the question was, will you give up that which is
Sorry,
valuable
that
to
was
you
that
to
was
follow
that
me?
was me. That was me on a tangent. I mean, not
No, you're good.
completely relevant, but I
Right.
admit that was not the direct question anymore.
Okay. Yeah, but I think when it comes to Abraham, right, the question was, are you willing to sacrifice? I mean, and we all have that question, and Jesus taught something similar. Are you going to give up your family and follow me? Are you going to give up the riches and follow me? Are you going to give up all the stuff that you have and follow me? And the question is, do we say, I want this over God, or is God the first priority of our life? And so that is the question is, what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to give up? Now, God, in his foreknowledge, because he knows all things, knew that Abraham was going to say, yes, I'm willing to give up anything and follow you. And he wasn't actually going to have Abraham kill his son. So it's not like God was like, oh no, he's actually going to do it. Oh, stop, stop, stop. Like that was never part of the plan.
So was
But again,
he
I think it
deceiving
wasn't,
Abraham?
I don't think he was deceiving. He was just saying, would you give up that which is most important to you and follow me? And it's like if God were to ask me, would you give up your career on YouTube if it meant following me? And I'm like, yes, YouTube is not more important than God. I will delete my YouTube right now. And he goes,
It
look, and then
wasn't a
God would be
question,
like,
right? It was a command to kill, not a question of if he would do it. So he
okay,
made Abraham
so
think that he wanted him to kill his son, which he didn't.
right. So but the question is, I think the point still remains. If God said, hey, delete your YouTube and follow me. And then the question is, are
Hmm.
you actually going to go through with it? And if I'm like, sure, yeah, sure, I'll delete YouTube right now. I don't care that I've been working on this for years. Following you is more important. And then he goes, okay, hey, you don't have to do it. I just wanted to see if you actually would. And you've shown that you actually do want to follow and love me. And so, yeah, there is a part in which is a test to see what are we willing to give up and follow God. Now, the whole reason I brought this up, and I feel like this is now, as you mentioned, a tangent, is that was super normal because that's what all the gods required back then. And so that wasn't weird for Abraham. When we look at God commanding the Israelites to kill people, that was an act of judgment, I would argue, not just random. And so that's why I would question if all of a sudden God's like, I want you to kill all the Jewish people. I'd be like, wait, what? Because it's like, okay, this is not an act of judgment. These are innocent human beings. You have called us to protect innocent human beings. This seems to be going against, or this does go against everything that I understand about who God to be. And so I probably would not do it and consider that this is Satan trying to deceive me, or this is my own sinful thoughts and brokenness or whatever, I probably wouldn't just
Sure.
do it. I would have to have clear and convincing proof that this is something called by God and is reasonable to do. And I think this is another thing that's important. And the last thing I'll say here is that God, I think, because so divine command theory in like a Muslim sense would be God can command whatever he wants and whatever he commands is good. I would say his divine commands are limited by his nature, that God cannot call sin good. God cannot make sin good. And so God's commands are restricted by logic. So God can't die. God can't make a square circle. God can't make a married bachelor sort of thing. But then God can also, he cannot contradict his nature. And so that's where I would question the fact of this command seems to contradict God's perfectly good nature and what he has called us to do. And therefore I'm probably not understanding him correctly. And I would question it. Yeah.
That was the one of the two questions. The other one was, what if it was actually God's command? Would it then be moral to do it?
So if I somehow had absolute proof beyond a reasonable doubt that God was commanding this, then I think it would be moral, because God can only command that which is moral, and therefore to do it would be moral.
Yeah. I mean, we see something similar with some of the genocides in the Old Testament, right? Like, even if we assume that the adults were very evil, right? A lot of kids still get slaughtered, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't use the word genocide, and that's another conversation. But,
sure. Just killing of thousands of people, going into them at once, telling them to either leave their country or we're going to kill you all, right? Including kids, etc., etc. May not be genocide, but it depends on the definition. It's close, at the very least, right?
Well, I think it's an act of judgment, and that's how I would put it. When you look throughout Scripture, God is judging these people for their wickedness, and God used the same judgment against the Israelites when they rebelled against Him as well. And so, it was not simply killing them simply because of their ethnicity, but it was because of their wickedness and the things that they were practicing, and the fact that everyone has been involved in this, and it's a society-wide thing that is happening here. And we also recognize that there is a sense in which it's hyperbolic, because not everyone was killed. And so it was often the people who stayed behind and fought that got killed, and the people that fled, they stayed alive, because we see them show up later on in the story. And so I think there's a lot of nuance and a lot of things to kind of understand. And that's a whole big conversation on genocide in the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah.
But I think ultimately it was God
numbers,
having a reason for it.
Yeah, there's a lot of apologetics in different directions for those slaughters.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that people explain it. I think ultimately, here's what it comes down to. I would argue that God is not under the same moral obligations that we are, since he is not a creation, but he is the creator. And a bad analogy that I use, but I think it works, at least it gets the point across, is the guitar. If you're watching on YouTube, anybody, the guitar hanging on the wall behind me. And the question is, can I grab that guitar, take it, and smash it on the ground? Is that wrong for me to do? And the answer is, well, no, why not? Because it's mine. Now, Carl, what if you
No. It's
okay.
not okay because it's yours. It's okay because it's not sentient. It doesn't feel pain. It's not sentient or self-aware. It's just not. You owning it. If you owned a person and it was legal at the time because, I don't know, slavery, it doesn't mean you can do what you want to it. It's not okay because you own it.
No, I agree with that. I agree with what you just said there about slavery, but I would say that we actually can never own people. And so I wouldn't say that applies here. I'm just saying the point is this, is what if you, Carl, came in my office, grabbed the guitar off my wall and smashed it on the ground? Would that be wrong?
I mean, that's not immorally wrong in the damage done to the guitar on like a personal level, but just as in harming property, right?
Right, but I think most people say it's wrong. Like, you should not come in my office and just smash my guitar. And the answer is, well, why not? And you go, well, it's not yours. You can't do whatever you want with. I think one of the things that has to be considered, and this is one piece of the puzzle, is that when it comes to God, God is the owner of everything. He's the creator of everything. He is the authority over everything. And therefore, he has the ability to do things that we do not have the ability to do. Another way in which I think this plays out, for example, is, and now we're talking about sentient humans, is I like watching cop videos on YouTube. I was watching this one video where the cyclist was almost hit by a car. The cyclist then pulls the car over and detains the car while he waits for the cops to show up. And actually the cyclist is the one that got in trouble. And the cop said, you do not have the authority to detain people. You illegally
Hmm.
detain them. Now, but the question is, does the cop have the authority to detain people? Yes, the cop does. And so detaining
Yep.
someone, it depends on whether you are in a position of authority to do it or not, changes whether it is right or wrong to do it. So if a cop arrests someone for right reasons, then that's not wrong. But I cannot just arrest, so there's recognition of authority and then also of ownership. And so I think with all of these combined, I would just say this, that God has the ability to do things, being the ultimate authority and the creator of all, that we do not have the ability to do, as we are not in ultimate authority and we are not the creator of all. And so in the same way, if I said, hey, Carl, I want you to come over to my house, take my guitar off the wall and smash it, you now have the ability to do that. Why? Because I, as the owner of that guitar, gave you the authority to do it. In the same way that if a cop says, hey, grab these handcuffs and please put them on this guy, it's now not wrong for you to handcuff a person because the cop is giving you the authority to do it. And so that's all I'm saying is the point is, I think that God is in a different moral position than we are, being the creator, we are created, being the authority, we are not the authority, to which then he has the ability to do things that I can't do. But also if he does command me to do some things, then it does become right because he is giving me the authority to do it. But all of that, as I said
I
before, is limited by
I
his good nature.
uh, I have to completely disagree with all of that.
Okay.
The cop thing is a legal thing. It's not a moral thing. So if you have some guy who's, I don't know, trying to rape some girl, whether a cop detains and stops him or a civilian, the moral aspect is identical. Even if, based on the law at the time, the guy might get in trouble for stopping the crime, since he doesn't have the same legal authority as the cop, the moral aspect is the same. And the other disagreement is that I don't think God owns us. But yeah.
Right, but that would be the theological difference of Second Corinthians says I bought you with a price, and he is the creator and owner and sustainer of all. And so there's biblical reason from a Christian worldview to start from that position. That was part of the conversation today
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
recognize
Yeah.
secularism would not recognize or accept. So yeah, there's moral components. There's others. I would say though, yeah, if it's put it this way, if I just walked into your house, threw you in handcuffs and carried you to my basement where I have a jail cell I built in my basement and I throw you in there, am I doing something
Hmm.
immoral? Well,
I mean,
yes.
yes, and
It's
so
not
would
just
it be if it
we
was a?
don't.
It would be equally wrong if it was a cop doing it.
For sure, because the cop doesn't have the authority to go arrest some innocent human being and throw them in a jail cell he built in his basement.
Yeah,
But when
nobody does.
a judge rightly convicts someone and throws them in jail, it's not
Rightly,
immoral
but
because he
now
has
you're
the authority
shifting
to do
it.
it. Yeah,
Now he's
exactly.
Yeah, but now he's guilty. You're shifting it from innocent to not, right?
Right,
Even
but
if the cop or the judge has a higher level of authority, going in, breaking into somebody's innocent house and tying them up somewhere, it could be the president, it could be a random person. Morally, it is wrong.
but the point I guess I'm trying to make is different. The point I'm trying to make is, let's say I, as a normal human being, find a guilty
Hmm.
person, go
Hmm.
arrest them and throw them in a jail that I built in my basement. Is that wrong?
Hmm.
Well, yes,
I
because I
mean,
don't have
yeah.
the authority to judge. But if a judge finds a guilty person and throws them in jail, then it's not wrong because he does have the authority to judge. And so that's when it is a similar situation to where the person in authority would be right in doing it, and just and justified, and I would be wrong and not justified. And so, yes, there's times when both the authority and the individual would both be wrong. But I'm trying to find a situation in that case in which the authority would
Yeah,
be justified in doing it and I would be wrong in doing it. And then the
I
difference is
think
I don't have the authority. They do.
the analogy doesn't quite work because this relies on a legal system and not a moral system, and because the legal system we have set up that has cops enforcing laws is a necessity for the structure. If everyone were allowed to do it, it would be chaotic. So, as a random bonus for my utilitarianism, I generally subscribe to rule utilitarianism, just to just because it tends to lead to better results, I predict, which would also lead to deontological rules to follow, sort of. But that's
Yeah.
slightly split.
Right. And so that's a different kind of the worldview aspect that I started the show with, would use and hold to that there is not an inherent connection between the laws that society creates and morality. So it's not
No,
that
I mean,
morality, it's not,
absolutely is.
so you
But
think,
it's not one to one in all the cases, right? For one, we try to have a legal system that does its best to represent a moral system and, morality aside, to lead to a better well-being society, right? And also, to some degree, what people think of as morality is influenced by the legal laws of their culture, right?
That definitely does
But I
influence
don't
people. I
think
don't think it determines it.
it
Yeah.
doesn't, yeah, exactly, it doesn't determine it. So just
Yeah.
because in a legal system it would be okay for a cop to do it doesn't mean it morally is. And the
For sure.
authority of the cop doesn't, yeah, basically.
No,
Sorry.
absolutely. And I agree with you fully on that one is, yeah. And I think that's why I would say, morality is our guide. Laws should be a reflection of morality. So just because something is legal does not make it good. And just because something is
Indeed.
illegal doesn't make it bad. And so there's a moral framework that is should be guiding and determining a lot of that. And that also doesn't mean that everything immoral should be illegal. Like, yeah, I think it's immoral to get drunk, but I don't think it should be illegal. I think it's immoral to lie, but I don't think you should go to jail every time you lie. So, it's not always a one-to-one correlation. But I do think
Yeah,
that if something
definitely.
is morally good, if we make that thing illegal, I think that would be bad. And then I think something like morally wrong, like slavery, when we made slavery
Hmm.
legal, I think that is bad. And so I
Hmm.
think that when something is morally good and it's illegal, or morally bad and it's legal, that's where there's a disconnect that needs to be fixed. But that doesn't mean that everything, should connect one to one, that everything immoral should be illegal. So anyways, well, hey, if you have the last word, I'll give it to you. I got to get running. It's 3:30. But hey, I really did appreciate this conversation, Carl. Really, really fun, really fascinating, very thoughtful. I do appreciate it. Any last word from you?
Yeah, no problem. I'll drop by another time.
Wonderful.
Mm, yeah, yeah, sure. If I were to go with a last question, in aspect to the divine command theory here, when you look at God and when you say what you predict God would say, the code he is held to, and it is somewhat innate due to his nature, not quite chosen, but also not external. What structure or pattern would you see there? So one could argue, for example, that the well-being of humans would be one, let's say, principle that guides at least some of the rules he gives. Um, yeah, is there any structure to that, or is it kind of one thing that really dictates everything else?
I'm not sure exactly if I'm following the question on how I can answer. Because I think
Sorry.
part of it, I think, is I was also thinking of discussing whether God's nature, the standard, and that kind of stuff is going to be the show of the topic, or the topic of the show next week. Is I've received a lot of
Mhm.
objections like, well, what if God's nature is actually evil? And so the evil God hypothesis. And so I do want to talk about that next week. And so maybe my mind kind of jumped to that, and then I might have missed some of the things that you said in responding. But yeah, so sorry about that.
No problem, no problem. It was in the sense of when you, for example, would receive a command, what you perceive it, right? You would analyze it and say, is this really God speaking to me? And I was wondering kind of by what principles, such as potentially utilitarianism, right? You hear God say something that has very negative effects for many people. You might doubt it. If you see principles or structures between the rules that God gives through his goodness,
Yeah.
patterns in his goodness.
Okay, yeah, and I think it's because, so again, it's not that I think that utilitarianism is completely wrong. It's that I think that it by itself doesn't provide the foundation for the objective moral values and duties that we experience. But I would say that within a Christian view of ethics, if God is in a Christian sense, God has called us the greatest, according to Jesus, the two greatest commands is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It is based on
Hmm.
love. And so if we are
Hmm.
actually doing that, and because God is love, we now have an objective value of love because God created humans in his image. Humans are objectively valuable and worthy of dignity and respect. And now we have a
Hmm.
moral duty and obligation to love people, that when we do that, it is going to be the greatest good for the greatest number of people. it is going to cause flourishing. And therefore, I think we can use pragmatism and utilitarianism and some of these things to help us understand what may be good or bad. And like, if I'm actually producing a horrible result for a bunch of people, then I should question whether that is the loving thing.
Indeed.
The issue is, I think that utilitarianism by itself cannot answer or ground
doesn't have the basis for
the basis for what we understand. But I think that if we have a Christian ethic that does provide the foundation of objective moral values and duties, then we should see the human flourishing as a result, as we are called to love
even
God and
if
love
the
people.
Bible, aside from establishing, God basically only had the moral guide of love your neighbor as yourself, you could build on some of those logical chains that would mirror, for example, utilitarianism, still the rules that follow, like don't murder, don't steal, etc.
Yeah, and I think it then would flow out into producing these positive results that I think you're discussing. So,
okay. Well,
unfortunately, I do got to run. I'm a little bit over, but next week we'll also kind of, I think, pair from this really well of looking at God's nature and how we understand that to be. And so I think we kind of jump started that
once
conversation.
A week at this time, or?
Yeah, so normally it's every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time. Unfortunately, I said at the very beginning of the show that next week I'm finishing up a college course that I'm teaching, and all my grades are due on Wednesday, so I don't think I'll have the time to live stream on Tuesday. So I'll see if I can push it back to Thursday or Friday next week. So you can, I'll post on the community feature of when that's happening, but it will get pushed back later in the week. But typically, it's every Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Pacific time, and I go for about 2 hours.
All right, cool. Enjoy your day. God
Carl,
bless
thank you. Great conversation. Appreciate it.
See you next time.
All right, see you later. All right, everybody, thank you so much for being here. That was such a fun conversation. That is what I love about this show. That is what I love about going live, is that challenge and that pushback and just encouraging people to think well and think deeply. And that is what this show is about, and how do we engage well. So Carl, thank you for that call. Everybody, thank you for being here. Hopefully it was enjoyable to you. And if it was, share, like, subscribe, spread the word, because this is what helps the information get out there and more people see it. And hopefully more people learn how to have better conversations about things that actually matter, instead of just fighting and arguing all the time. So anyways, hopefully you saw a respectful conversation where Carl and I were able to discuss some things that were important. I didn't get through all the book, but hey, if you want to continue to dive deeply into the Christian worldview, that's a great book for you there. Again, next week, Evil God Hypothesis, and then TikTok videos the week after that, and more stuff coming up. So anyways, have a wonderful rest of your day and continue to think deeply, because these things are worth thinking deeply about. See you next time, everybody. Bye.